Alright, we're starting another reaction. We are at hour 15 and a half of the 24 hour. So we got a little under 9 hours left. So it is 5:30 in the morning. I'm going till 2. So we got every war crime explained. Shoutout Trust Me Bro.
I'm explained. There's an old saying that goes, all is fair in love and war. But I would argue that saying is totally and utterly wrong. And unless you would consider breaking up a happy family to get the girl of your dreams, or killing innocent civilians to satisfy your political means as fair, then I would imagine you would agree. And in that case, I think
that's like almost every fucking country in the world right now.
The fact that there is literally things that are legal and illegal in war bolsters my theory, and also brings us to the point of today's video. War undoubtedly is one of the most hellish experiences available on Earth. And somewhat paradoxically, war has its own code of ethics. Now, whether or not these codes are actually followed or not depends. Regardless, there are some acts, weapons, and strategies that are considered simply too cruel for war. And in today's video, I'm going to describe in detail every single thing that is banned or illegal in war, starting with the earliest recorded examples of war crimes and ending in the current standards for ethical warfare, aka everything that is considered a war crime. Let's begin. Ancient rules of war. With how brutal day-to-day life was thousands of years ago, it's almost hard to imagine how brutal war must have been in that time period. However, believe it or not, even in some of the earliest civilizations, the concept of ethical war and war crimes was present, albeit in a rather rudimentary way. Now, it's important to note that the term war crime has really only existed since the 1800s, although the concept of rules in warfare predates that by thousands of years, and actually has set the foundation for modern war crimes and war standards today. I'm going to keep this section brief, although I did want to quickly mention a few interesting and unique war crimes from a handful of different ancient civilizations. Starting in ancient India, going back all the way to roughly 600 BCE, ancient Indian texts proved that there was a code of conduct when it came to warfare, and this code of conduct was known as the Dharma Yuddha, essentially translating to righteous warfare. The principles of the Dharma Yuddha were meant to be taken as law, and it was said that breaking these rules during warfare would result in moral consequences. And the rules stated in the Dharma Yuddha are the following. Firstly, equal fights only. And what this meant was that chariots were only meant to attack chariots, and one soldier could only attack one soldier. If there was a battle taking place, the battle was meant to be fair. Secondly, no attacking sleeping, retreating, or surrendering soldiers. And on top of this, you may also not harm unarmed women, children, elderly people, or disabled people. The third law of the Dharma Yuddha states that combat begins after sunrise and ends after sunset.
War.
And the fourth law states that there may be no poisoned, barbed, or hidden weapons used in warfare. And finally, surrendered enemy soldiers must be protected and treated as prisoners of war, and wounded enemies who surrender to you must be treated and cared for. During 5th century BCE in ancient China, they too had their own code of conduct when it came to warfare, with some of the most notable examples being the following. Firstly, no attacking unready enemies. This would essentially eliminate sneak attacks or ambushes. Secondly, you were not to take advantage of fleeting or surrendering enemies in distress, meaning that if there is an enemy that is retreating or simply unoffensively tending to his own wounds, you may not take advantage of that situation, and ideally you would offer them help if they are truly surrendering. Interestingly, it was also around this time when Sun Tzu's book, The Art of War, was released, and in it he emphasized the importance of strategy over brutality in warfare, and suggested focusing on subduing power players to avoid excessive destruction in cities.
Pretty good.
Now, while this may seem noble and ahead of its time,
you can apply
it's
it
important
to a lot
to know
of
that this
different
wasn't
shit,
a
like,
humanitarian play.
not only war.
This was simply an example of high-leverage strategies to be used ideally in war. This doesn't mean that they would be against brutality if strategy didn't work. The teachings just advised trying to use strategy when possible. Okay, quickly putting history and crime to the side for just a moment, I wanted to ask, have you been putting off making a doctor's appointment even though you know you should? If you have,
hey.
you're not alone. In every health, even the doctor to book.
Nobody trying to hear that shit,
And
man.
finally, during the 8th century
Ain't nobody
BCE
trying to hear that
in
shit.
ancient
I think
Greece,
I got a
there
broken
was
toe.
a set of customary rules known
I ain't
as
going
the
to the
common
doctor.
laws of the
What the fuck is
Hellenes
he talking
when
about?
it came to warfare. And these laws were the following. If you are to partake in war, an official declaration is required. If a war is ongoing, you still must respect sacred truces. And one example of this would be the Olympic Games. Thirdly, if you were in possession of dead enemies, you had to return them if requested. And finally, you may not mutilate enemy corpses, as it was considered barbaric. Now, a couple of notes about these Greek rules specifically. For starters, these were not necessarily written, followed rules. These were actually unwritten customs that were, well, customary and agreed upon across different Greek city-states. And it's important to note that these rules specifically applied to inter-Greek conflicts, with the sole goal of limiting brutality when it comes to Greek-on-Greek violence and warfare. With that being said, that means that these rules did not apply to non-Greek barbarians. Meaning that if you were a Greek soldier fighting a non-Greek soldier, all of these rules were out of the window. And even if you were a Greek soldier fighting a different Greek soldier, because enforcement was so weak on these rules, and this was more or less of a gentleman's agreement, having these rules be followed was, well, on a case-by-case basis, to say the least. But now that we are armed with ancient historical context when it comes to rules of war and war crimes, I want to jump directly to the establishment of the modern war crime to describe exactly how war crimes came to be in the first place and how the term war crime evolved from its establishment in the roughly 1800s to the modern day, the Lieber Code. As we've discussed so far in this video, throughout history, there have been countless cultures with countless different customs or rules or gentlemen's agreements when it comes to warfare. But it wasn't until 1863, with the establishment of the Lieber Code, that there was ever one formalized, codified system that sought to govern and be the official law when it came to war. Was born in 1798 in Berlin, and as a young adult, Francis was exposed to the horrors of war. He first fought for Prussia in the Napoleonic Wars, and then later fought in the Greek War of Independence less than a decade later. Fortunately, Francis survived both of these wars, and ended up moving to America and became an academic. He worked in the University of South Carolina as a tenured professor for both history and political economy. And it was actually at this job where he met Major General Henry W. Halleck. And shortly after becoming professionally acquainted, Francis was commissioned by this Major General to write the first instructions for the government of the armies of the United States in the field, aka the General's Orders 100, aka the Lieber Code. And the initial purpose of the Lieber Code was to be the military law that governed the actions of the Union Army during the Civil War. Now, this was no small task. Francis Lieber was literally just asked to make the rules of war for an entire army based off of basically all of the customs of war to ever exist. And while this job may seem daunting, he was the perfect man for the job, as he had both war experience, law experience, and political experience. And what he presented to the American government at the time not only went on to shape the Civil War, but also served as the basis for other warfare-related laws that came later down the line. One notable example being the Geneva Convention, which we're going to discuss soon. Now, with that being said, let's dive into exactly what the Lieber Code suggests should and shouldn't be allowed in war. Now, it's important to note that the Lieber Code literally has 157 articles, which is why I'm going to discuss the main points specifically pertaining to war crimes, or what should not be allowed in war. According to the Lieber Code, the following acts are either admissible under military necessity or outright forbidden in any context, and they go as follows. Firstly, and kind of ironically, the first thing that is prohibited is cruelty, which to me sounds like a complete oxymoron, saying that cruelty is banned in war. But in the context of the Lieber Code, it is suggested that the infliction of suffering for the sake of suffering or revenge is unnecessary. And how this could look on the battlefield is if your goal is to kill your enemy, you may do so effectively and quickly. However, if you are intentionally doing it in a slow or cruel way, potentially injuring non-vital limbs, that could be considered intentional cruelty and be punishable by death according to the Lieber Code. There's quite a few things that are considered war crimes under the Lieber Code, so for the rest of these, I'm going to kind of go rapid fire. Other notable acts that are considered war crimes under the Lieber Code are as follows. Torturing enemy soldiers, including to extort them for confessions. Using poison in any way. Any act of hostility that makes returning to peace unnecessarily difficult. Destruction of property that is not commanded by an authorized officer. Robbery, specifically stealing private items off of enemy soldiers. Rape of any kind. Wounding, maiming, or killing civilians. Committing any crime against civilians, including arson, murder, robbery, fraud, or forgery. Killing prisoners of war, racially discriminating prisoners of war, and firing upon outposts, sentinels, or pickets. Now, even with that small bit of context, it's easy to understand that the core purpose of the Lieber Code was to minimize cruelty and prolonged suffering as much as possible within the context of war. And with the Lieber Code literally being the first draft ever made in the context of war crimes and international humanitarian law, it's truly not a bad first draft, especially for being made by one guy. And the Lieber Code was thought to be so fair and so revolutionary at the time that on April 24th, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln himself issued the Lieber Code to be the official binding military law for the Union Army throughout the American Civil War. And while the Lieber Code initially had a very niche application, at least in a global context, it would soon go on to become the global standard when it comes to humanitarian law during warfare, as well as the global governing law when it comes to war crimes. But with that being said, the Lieber Code was the first ever formal recognition and establishment of what war crimes were and consisted of, although these rules only applied to one army for one war, and did not become federal or international law until later. Which brings us to our next section, the Hague Conventions. Following the end of the American Civil War, the concept of federal or potentially even international laws regarding war became a popular thought experiment among political figures, military strategists, and academics alike. And it was for this reason that the Hague Conventions were established. The Hague Conventions were a series of international treaties and declarations negotiated in both 1988 and 1907 at two different peace conferences in the Netherlands. And the Hague Conventions were the precursor to the famous Geneva Conventions, which we'll get into next. But the Hague Conventions are extremely important in the context of war crimes because just like the Lieber Code was the first ever recognized law for warfare, the Hague Conventions was the first ever international law when it came to war crimes, and laws of war. And as I stated earlier, the Lieber Code was a massive influence on the Hague Conventions, although the two are not identical, with the Hague Conventions affirming the Lieber Code but also adding the following. And just for context, I'm going to be combining both Hague Conventions into one, because the 1899 and the 1907 Hague Conventions are both similar. The 1907 Hague Conventions were just a revision of the original. So for that reason, I'm just going to here. With that being said, notable new war crimes include killing or wounding an enemy who has laid down his arms or no longer has a means of defense, improperly using national flags, military insignias, or military uniforms, using bullets which expand or flatten easily in the human body, attacking or bombarding towns, villages, dwellings, or buildings that are undefended, looting towns that are occupied, declaring no mercy or refusing surrender, forcing civilians in occupied territories to give up information about their country's army or its means of defense, collective punishments for acts of individuals, general destruction or pillaging of private property unless demanded by military necessity, attacking hospital ships or medical personnel, not respecting neutral powers and territories, and automatic submarine contact mines must not become indiscriminate hazards after control is lost. Which I have no idea how you would even go about, well, collecting mines in an area you've already lost. Like, if the mines are there and then you've lost control of the area or the mine itself, I don't know how you're going to make it indiscriminate. If a contact mine comes in contact, it's going off. But regardless, the Hague Conventions were groundbreaking when it came to international humanitarian and warfare law. It also made some interesting changes when it came to warfare in general, like the addition of laws pertaining to naval warfare. But of course, the establishment of war crimes did not end with the Hague Conventions, which leads us to our next and likely most famous conventions, the Geneva Conventions. Here we are. That's right, which you've all been waiting for. The most famous and also most recent adaptation of the list of actions that are considered war crimes, as well as other codes of conduct when it comes to warfare and humanitarian stuff. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 are the most famous Geneva Conventions and consist of 4 different treaties. These 4 treaties consist of previous Geneva Conventions. Interestingly, the Geneva Conventions actually date back to the 1860s, predating the Hague Conventions, but that initial Geneva Convention really only focused on one thing, and I figured I would put all of the Geneva Conventions together and chronologically time it with the 1949 Geneva Conventions because that's where it really became its final form, so to speak. If you're unfamiliar, the Geneva Convention itself is the core of all modern international humanitarian law, or IHL, and its sole goal is to protect the victims of armed conflicts. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 were of course a byproduct of the end of the Second World War, where many crimes against humanity and war crimes were committed. And on top of the Geneva Conventions in 1949, we also saw the establishment of the Nuremberg Principles, which isn't worth its own section, but essentially the Nuremberg Principles were created not necessarily to define war crimes, but to ensure war crimes were punished. And because there was a lot of Nazi Party members after World War II who committed war crimes, the International Law Commission and United Nations saw it was vital that they created the Nuremberg Principles to ensure all of these guilty individuals did not escape punishment. To put it briefly, the Nuremberg Principles basically state that anybody who commits a war crime is, well, a war criminal. And most importantly, anybody who commits a war crime is subject to penalty at an international level with international law. And internal laws of a country cannot impede or override this international law. Essentially meaning that if you were a Nazi general who committed a war crime, the German government could not change their local laws to get you off of the hook for this war crime, because the war crime or international law supersedes the national law. And on top of this, the Nuremberg Principles also ensured that political status did not relieve the war criminal of their punishment, which is important. But yeah, that's basically the Nuremberg Principles, just ensuring that the laws were actually taken seriously and enforced. But back to the Geneva Conventions. The first Geneva Convention was actually introduced, like I mentioned, in 1864, and was specifically aimed at creating rules around the treatment of sick and wounded armed forces on the battlefield. The second Geneva Convention actually replaced the Hague Convention of 1907, and essentially contained everything from the first Geneva Convention and the Hague Conventions. The third Geneva Convention was focused on the treatment of war prisoners and replaced the previous Geneva Convention, and the fourth and final Geneva Convention is the one we're discussing now, which is basically the all-encompassing Geneva Convention. Now, with all of this being said, before I say Geneva Convention for the millionth time, let me explain some of the newest additions introduced with the Geneva Conventions. Once again, this list includes introductions from all of the Geneva Conventions, dating from the 1860s to the 1940s. The Geneva Gas Protocol states that the use of any asphyxiating, poisonous, or other gases and biological warfare methods are strictly prohibited and considered war crimes. Torture, inhumane treatments, including biological experiments, are also war crimes. Compelling a prisoner of war or other protected person, like civilians, to serve in the forces of a hostile power is a war crime. Depriving a prisoner of war or enemy civilian of their rights and a regular trial is a war crime. And instead of just repeating myself and saying everything's a war crime, everything I'm about to say is a war crime. Taking of hostages, unlawful deportation or unlawful confinement,
All
any
this
act
shit
that
happens in
outrages
war.
personal dignity, specifically humiliating or degrading treatment of a protected person, any type of violence, murder, or mutilation of a protected person. You must search for, collect, care for, and evacuate without discrimination when it comes to prisoners of war. You must not attack medical transports or facilities. You must not deprive prisoners of war of food, clothing, medical care, and they must not do forced labor in dangerous or hostile conditions. You must protect one's family's honor and religious practices, and you must not make any indiscriminate attacks. In addition to these, you cannot use human shields, you cannot attack cultural objects or monuments, you cannot intentionally starve civilians as a method of warfare, and you cannot attack undefended or demilitarized zones. And this, of course, is also in addition to all of the other previous laws and rules I suggested. That is, after the ancient ones. The ancient ones don't apply here. But yeah, once again, I'm sure you can see another common theme amongst all of these codes and conventions. The underlying thesis is that these rules are supposed to prohibit unnecessary suffering across the board and specifically protect non-participants in the war, aka sick, elderly, injured, or civilians. And one of the biggest changes with the Nuremberg trials and the Geneva Conventions is the mandate for accountability of people who break these war crimes. But yeah, if you were like me and were shocked when you learned that there was rules to war and, well, a lot of them, you were probably also super shocked when you learned that, according to Geneva Conventions, if you come across enemy soldiers that are surrendering to you or injured, you have to essentially take care of them and treat them as one of your own, which is something I did not know at all. And
Yeah,
while
that
I'm
does
curious
not
how much this
happen.
is actually well honored, it is nice to see that there is at least rules in place to take care of your fellow human, even in some of the most hellish and disgusting conditions ever imaginable. But with that, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. If you were to ask what constitutes a war crime, the informed answer would be, that depends.
All right.
Specific
I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little disappointed in that video. But hey, man, good effort. Wasn't as interesting as I thought. Maybe it's tired talking, but that was all right.